So now we'll start with part two of our series in two parts on establishing the southern colonies. So in our last part one, we talked about the establishment of Virginia as a colony. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Maryland and the rest of the southern colonies. So Section C, Maryland. In 1634, Lord Baltimore, a very rich noble in England, had a problem. He was Catholic, and England was a Protestant country. And at that time, anybody who was not a Protestant Christian, especially who was Catholic, was persecuted, picked on, often faced fines or imprisonment. And so Lord Baltimore decided that he wanted a place that he could go to send his fellow English Catholics where they could live and have religious freedom. And so Lord Baltimore went to the King of England and asked for permission to do this. He was friends with the King of England. He promised them that he would give them some of the profits from the colony. And so he got a charter from the King of England to found the colony of Lord Baltimore. Found the colony of Maryland. There were some problems immediately from the start of founding Maryland. First of all, it was supposed to be a place for Catholics. And some Catholics did move to Maryland. But the problem was there were lots of poor people who were in Virginia, former indentured servants, and they didn't have any land. They didn't have any place to go, but there was really rich land up in Maryland. And so instead of moving west, these former indentured servants, up into the hill country where the Indians were, they just moved north. And so we have all of these Virginians who were former indentured servants or runaways moving north into Maryland and gobbling up some of the land along the coast, some of this really rich land that you could grow tobacco. But the problem is a lot of these a lot of these men from Virginia were Protestants. They were members of the Church of England, and they're moving up to Maryland in such big numbers that they're threatening to turn this Catholic colony into a Protestant colony, which of course would go against the whole reason for founding Maryland. So these few rich Catholics who were living in Maryland, they feel threatened. They're upset that if all of these Protestants keep moving in from Virginia, that they're going to eventually pass a law getting rid of Catholicism in this very Catholic colony. And so what they do is they pass the Act of Toleration in 1649. The Catholic wealthy people in Maryland will pass this law to protect their Catholicism. The Act of Toleration, what it does is it says that all kinds of Christianity are legal in Maryland. It doesn't matter if you're Protestant or Catholic or Quaker or whatever, you can practice your religious beliefs as long as you're Christian in the state of Maryland. And that will keep them safe even if the Protestants who are moving in do eventually take over the control of the government of the colony. They will be able to keep practicing their Catholicism without being persecuted. This is the first act of religious freedom in the American colonies. Now, to what extent is it religious freedom? Only Christians could practice their religious freedom, but still all kinds of Christians could. So it's an important precedent to set for American history. So let's move away from Maryland for a while and let's go to something that's not even in the current United States. It's the West Indies. So Section D. The West Indies is what we commonly call the Caribbean. English people had moved into the West Indies or the Caribbean in large numbers because it was a tropical climate, and as you can see from the picture, they were growing sugar there. And sugar was an amazing crop to become rich almost overnight. So we see all of these English people moving into the Caribbean to grow sugar. Now, the English aren't going to grow it themselves. And so what they do is they use the natives. They use the natives as slaves to grow the sugar. But the problem is the natives have no resistance to European diseases, and they die off. And so they start importing African slaves by the hundreds of thousands into these sugar islands or these West Indian islands. So we see all of these Africans start to come into these English colonies as slaves. Now, these rich sugar planters are going to dominate the colony. They are going to have all the power, all the wealth, and they keep buying up all the land on these islands, and so the middle and lower class English people, they can't compete. Their small little crop of sugar just can't compete on the world market with these huge plantations. And so slowly but surely they start to leave the Caribbean because they just can't compete with the rich people, and so where do they go? A lot of these West Indian English people who are leaving the lower and middle class, they leave the Caribbean and they will eventually go to South Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, places like that. And why that's important for U.S. history is because these former English people who were living in the Caribbean, they're not only going to bring some of their slaves with them, increasing slavery in the mainland colonies, but they're also going to bring their ideas of how to treat slaves. So we get this thing called the Barbados Slave Code. The Barbados Slave Code starts in Barbados, one of these English sugar islands, and it says that slaves are not human beings, that they are property, that you can buy and sell them, you can kill them if you want to, and not only are they your slaves, but their children are your slaves. It's a very unique kind of slavery that we really didn't see in many other places of the world, and that concept of slavery, that system of slavery, is going to go from the English Caribbean to the English colonial mainland because of these middle and lower class planters moving off and bringing this idea with them to South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, etc., the southern colonies. So let's talk about the Carolinas. So far of the southern colonies, we've talked about Virginia and Maryland. Now we have the Carolinas. The Carolinas are going to start out as one very big colony. There's no North Carolina or South Carolina. It's just Carolina. And it's named after King Charles II, and we have about 7 to 9 very rich men in England called proprietors, and they are really just businessmen. They go to the King of England, Charles, and they say, look, you owe us a lot of money. We don't need to go into the reasons why he owes them money, but he does. And they say, we'll forgive your debts if you just give us this huge chunk of land in the New World and give us a charter, give us permission to go to what we'll call the Carolinas after you, and let us make money. And so for the King of England, this is a win-win situation. Not only does he not have to pay his debts to these proprietors, but also he's going to get a piece of the profit being the king. And so he gives them, just gives them, to these 7 to 9 guys, it varies over time, he gives them all of this land, and he says, you guys own it. You do what you want with it as long as I get a piece of the action here, a little bit of your money. And so that's how we get the Carolinas. And so we see the Carolinas, they immediately are going to be settled by all these English people who are moving from the Barbados and the Caribbean, moving in, settling, bringing their slaves with them. But the Carolinas are also important because they are closely tied in to the Atlantic world's economic system. They make sugar, as we said, in the Caribbean, in Barbados and in the Bahamas and etc., and they make sugar there. And so if you have a plantation, a sugar plantation, let's say in Barbados, it's a really small island. And so every square inch of that island is going to be devoted to sugar growing, because the more sugar you grow, the more profit you make. But what about all these slaves? They need to eat. And so what are we going to do to feed them? There's no land available for food. It's just sugar production. And that's where the Carolinas come in. These proprietors who set up the colony in Carolina, what they're going to do is they're going to encourage the people who come to their colony to not grow sugar. It's too far north to grow sugar. But what they're going to do is they're going to grow food in the Carolinas. They're going to ship it to the rich plantation owners who grow sugar in the Caribbean, and that's how they're going to feed the slaves. So we see this kind of symbiotic relationship between the English in the Carolinas and the English in the Caribbean. The English in the Carolinas grow food, they cut down lumber, and they send it and sell it to the English in the Caribbean, who then use that lumber to build sugar mills or barns, and also use that food to feed their slaves. And we also see, of course, the most important food that they're going to grow in Carolinas is rice. They're going to grow that rice in the tidewater region of the Carolinas, that swampy coastal region, and then send it to feed all of these slaves in the Caribbean. And so we see, AP wants you to know that we have this very kind of intricate economy going on in the Atlantic world between the English colonies on the mainland and the English colonies in the Caribbean. Eventually, what we find out is that as the South Carolinians or the Carolinians grow rice to ship to the Caribbean, they find out that the white people who they're going to bring in as indentured servants to grow the rice, they die off at a pretty alarming rate, and they just don't want to do this hard, labor-intensive work. And so what they do is they start importing more slaves from either Africa or the Caribbean into Carolina, so the slave population of Carolina grows. And what they find out is not only do the slaves already know how to grow rice, because they were growing it back in Africa, but also they don't seem to die from malaria. The Africans over the years have developed something called sickle cells in their blood system, and it helps them to keep from dying from malaria. And they have that mutation, that unique characteristic of their body, and the white population doesn't. And so we see that South Carolinians or Carolinas continue to import massive numbers of Africans because they can grow the rice and not die, which they can sell then to the Caribbean. And so we see, because of this whole relationship, more and more slaves are coming into the Carolinas. So that's it for the Carolinas. Now let's move on to Georgia. Georgia is the last of the 13 colonies to be founded. It doesn't get founded until 1733, well into the 18th century. And Georgia is kind of a noble experiment. The man who founds Georgia is James Oglethorpe, and he again is a very wealthy Englishman. And he is a do-gooder. He's a philanthropist. He believes that he should use his wealth to do good things for people. And so he looks in England and he sees that there are tons of poor people in England who are in jail. And they're in jail because they fell into debt and they couldn't pay their debts. And they have to stay in jail until they can get out of debt. And they can't do that while they're in jail. And so he goes to the King of England and he says, look, I have an idea. Why don't you give me a charter? Give me permission to go to Georgia. I'll create a colony there. And I will just take all of your prisoners from your jails. You don't have to feed them anymore. You can get rid of them. We don't want these people in England anyway. And I will send them to Georgia, and they will have a new start in life. This is where the philanthropy comes in. He believes that all these people, they're not really criminals. They just are in jail because they couldn't pay their debts. And he's going to give them a second chance in life by freeing them and sending them to Georgia to work there. So he believes this is a good thing for England and also these people. The next reason the king agrees to go ahead and start Georgia is he believes it's a buffer state. You see, the Spanish you can see in this map, they own Florida, and the Spanish are very jealous of their New World colonies, and they don't want the English horning in on all of their colonies and wealth. And so when the English created colonies in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas, the Spanish got really nervous. They thought that the English may next take Florida from them. So every so often, as you can see in this red arrow, the Spanish would launch raids into the Carolinas, and they would kill these Englishmen who were making profits for the British with their rice, and that was hurting the British Empire. And so James Oglethorpe told the King of England, what we'll do is we'll settle Georgia, and we'll put all these poor people in Georgia. And when the Spanish come to attack, they're going to have to come kill all the poor people before they get to the people we care about in the Carolinas. And who cares if more poor people die? We'll just send in more, ex-cons. And so it acts as a buffer state. It separates the important, wealthy colony of Carolina from Florida. And again, if people in Georgia die, we really don't care about it. And so it'll act as protecting our English colonies in the Carolinas. So the king likes this a lot. As you can imagine, Georgia was extremely slow growing as a colony. People just didn't want to go to Georgia even. So if you're sitting in jail and you're English and somebody comes to you and says, look, we can free you, and here's the catch, you have to go to Georgia, people are like, I'd rather stay in jail. I'm not going to go to Georgia. They know that they're going to die if they go to Georgia, but the Spanish are going to attack them. And look at this picture of Georgia. It's extremely densely forested. It's really hot and humid. It's a very unhealthy climate for people at that time. And they knew they would probably die if they went to Georgia, either through attacks or just starvation or heat stroke or whatever. And so it was a very slow growth colony. Not a lot of people went. Another reason that it was slow to grow is because even when people did go, they died. Like I said, they're not going to want to go to Georgia. And then finally, the reason that we see people not wanting to go to Georgia is because James Oglethorpe, this do-gooder who starts the colony, he outlawed slavery. He said Georgia should be a place where people can get a fresh start in life, and slavery is counteractive to that. It's not good for African Americans, it's not good for white people, they compete for labor, and so he outlawed slavery. So even if you were, let's say, a rich Carolina planter and you wanted to increase your plantation and, move down into Georgia and maybe grow rice in Georgia too, you're not going to do it because you can't bring your slaves with you. And so for the reason of climate and Spanish attacks and not being able to bring slaves to turn a profit, very few people are actually going to move to Georgia. In fact, at the time of the American Revolution, really the only people that lived in Georgia were just along the coast in very small towns. The colony had still not grown very much by the time of independence. And that ends our slideshow, and so we have now finished part 2 of this lecture on establishing the southern colonies.